Welcome to BIPSI. I'm Jonathan Kolb. We're going to have a Meet the Author with Edward Shapiro, an old friend of mine, who has written this very interesting and important book, Finding a Place to Stand. It's about citizenship, and citizenship is a very, very difficult thing at this moment. Ed is a psychoanalyst and psychiatrist. He is a professor at the Yale Child Study Center at the moment, but he has been in all sorts of places. I met him at McLean, but we couldn't keep him at McLean for long. He then went to Austin Riggs. They kept him for a pretty long time, but he moves about. And what he's been moving about is understanding people not just internally, but in their contexts in families, in their contexts in organizations. And now he's taken that to in their context in society, in all their large organizations that they're part of. He brings a great deal of erudition to this project, having written a couple of books with his friend Wesley Carr, and having spent many years with the group relations conferences of the A.K. Rice Institute, and all of that has its start in the work of Wilfred Bion. So I'm very happy to have Ed here today and to have him try to help us understand what he's written about. I will just start with a question of, why did you decide to write this book?
Thanks, John. I was driven to write this book. I have had extraordinary luck in the places that I've had to learn that are outside the box. The positions that you mentioned, studying families, working in institutions, functioning as a psychoanalyst, and on two occasions, both in 1996 and this year, I had the opportunity to interview extensively unaffiliated voters in the context of presidential elections. So the learning that I began to get involved in began to feel connected. I'd written a bunch of papers, and I began to sense that I was working at something, and it needed to come together. So I felt that I was trying to understand something that mattered to me and that might matter to others, and I was driven to pass it on. So I tried to put these papers together. I couldn't, because I wrote so many papers and I was stuck in each of the ideas, so I hired an editor to read my papers and tell me which ones belonged together and which ones didn't, and he did. And having a shape focused my attention, and the ultimate bringing together of these ideas gave me this thought. We know from psychoanalysis that the individual is shaped by the engagement in the family. But if you begin to think about family as an organization, a social organization whose mission, if you will, is development, each member of the family has a role in relation to development. And role became the notion that I found extraordinarily useful, because each of us, when we take up a role, bring ourselves to it. So the person is there, but the setting has an impact on how that person engages in the role, and the role is shaped by the mission. So in a family, a kid has a role, a parent has a role, oldest sibling, youngest sibling, but they're also given and shaped by the system to have irrational roles, the angry one, the sad one, the provocative one. And that's true in institutions as well. You begin to think about it that way, and you begin to notice that the human system is interconnected, and bounded entities like institutions have missions that engage the people within it and shape the people within it. Then you begin to have another lens for looking at how we can affect the institutions that we're in particularly if their missions have to do with the needs of the outer world. And that begins to lead into a discussion of citizenship. That's the general theory behind what I discovered when I tried to put my ideas together.
I've mentioned and you've mentioned this concept, which I think is at the center of your message, which is how are they right? Maybe you should tell us a story to take us on that journey as though we're reading the book.
If I had to distill my entire career's learning into one sentence, that would be the one. Listening to how the other person is right. It was hard for me to learn, and it's been extraordinarily difficult to teach because it's so easy to hear how the other person is wrong, how they don't have enough information, how they're coming from the wrong perspective. All that stuff is easy, and it privileges us. Listening to how the other person is right is it's an insight, and it's been extremely useful to me. I'll give you a quick example. The story that really is at the core of this book, which I actually developed with Wesley and used in both of my books, the one I wrote with him and this one, is at the core of the argument about citizenship. Because the question that you get to, if you recognize that you have a role in an institution, and that role is a function of the mission, is how can you work in an institution to sharpen the mission? So here's the story. A young psychologist woman is hired to develop a child clinic in a larger system. So she has an office and little chairs for the kids and a desk. And regularly, her supervisor comes into her office and he sits on the desk and he puts his feet on the chairs. And this bothers her. She doesn't like it. But she's afraid to say anything to her supervisor because he's her boss. So she brings it into her psychoanalysis, where their task in that is to understand her mind. And the analyst appropriately interprets it as a transference displacement about the way she felt that her father stepped on the child in her without recognizing its value. Very useful for her, and it helped her put that in perspective. It didn't help her at work, because this guy was still putting his feet on the chairs. So the question then is there a way for any system, for anybody in a system to think of themselves in a role as representing a task? Could this woman have seen herself as a representative of a larger mission, and her supervisor as a similar representative? Could the culture of the institution be shaped so that they might have a conversation about this experience without offending everybody's narcissism? Could she say, for example, to her supervisor, you know, when you put your feet on the kids' chairs, it bothers me. And could he then think, am I, as a representative of the management, feeling on behalf of the institution some ambivalence about this child clinic? And if I'm actually feeling that in my role, can I listen to what she's saying to me in terms of how she's right, and can we develop a conversation about how the mission is being shaped? This is the story that opens up the structure of the book.
So maybe you can begin with the story of the boy with the can of Raid.
Yeah. So what I try to do to help these sometimes complicated ideas be accessible is to tell stories. The book is full of stories that I think might illuminate some of the ideas. One of the early stories I told comes out of a seminar that I did in a state hospital. I was working with a group of residents, and we were trying to figure out what was getting in the way of the kind of care that they were providing. And one of the residents presented the following case. An 8-year-old boy was admitted to the child unit in this hospital because of what was called unmanageable behavior. He was one of a bunch of kids, maybe 6 or 7 kids from an unmarried mother who most of the kids came from different fathers, and the father of this child was in jail. He was causing trouble at home. He was the youngest. And one day they were out shopping in a supermarket with all the kids, and there was a lot of turmoil. And the youngest went over to one of the grocery shelves and pulled out a can of Raid and opened it up and sprayed all of the siblings. The mother was freaked out, and she called the police because she couldn't manage him, and they sent the kid to the hospital. The resident who admitted the kid wrote him up. She had a lot of things to do. There were a lot of patients coming in. And when she interviewed the kid, she didn't see any trouble. He was organized and reasonable and appropriate. And since she was filled up with other cases, she wanted to try to manage this kid out into social services in order to take care of the social problem that she was seeing. And she brought this case to the seminar. In the seminar, she talked about how overwhelmed she was. And the seminar was thinking about all of the residents' feelings of being overwhelmed, and focusing on their reactions to the patients they were seeing as information about how they would take up their roles and provide better care. The residents were primarily interested in reducing the stimuli that they were struggling with. Part of what this resident was feeling was irritation. Why did she have to deal with this kid? The kid was fine. Parents were sending them in to manage a problem on the outside. And the seminar began to focus on her irritation as information. She was overwhelmed, like the mother was overwhelmed in the family on the outside. And she began to recognize that they had something in common. The problem was that she was also conflicted about the irritation she felt about this kid. She felt that a good clinician should take care of her patients and not try to get rid of them. So she felt guilty about that impulse. The seminar began to think about that irritation and the irritation that the mother might feel similarly about having too much to manage. As we began to think about that, we started thinking about the family system, and the role that this young kid might have in that family system. Could he possibly be empathizing with the mother's feeling of being overwhelmed? And could his action, the spraying Raid, be understood as an action on his mother's behalf to try to get rid of these pests? That idea in the seminar made everybody laugh and relax. And the resident began to think about that in a new way. It allowed her to go back to the mother and empathize with the mother's feeling of overwhelm when the mother finally came in, and say to the mother, could this kid be trying to get rid of the pests? Which allowed the mother to relax, to understand her feelings, to recognize that she needed help with her feelings, and she shouldn't manage more than she could manage. You know, when a family, when this kind of event happens, and a kid or a representative of the family bursts out into some other system, some of us call those messengers patients. But they're actually citizens of a family representing a system that's in trouble and asking for help with a larger system. It's another way to think about citizenship that the story opens up into.
So you use this lovely clinical story, which is embedded in a terrible social situation, both for the mother and for the state hospital, to illustrate the power of an interpretation and the usefulness of thinking about anything that somebody does or says as not only meaningful, but sometimes incredibly meaningful, sometimes very helpful. And I like the way you emphasize the helplessness that the resident was feeling, that all the residents were feeling in their system.
I think the key issue here is not so much that it's understandable, but actually the different lens that you use to try to understand it. You can understand the kid's behavior by using the lens of thinking about his individual psychology. Or you can widen your lens and think about the system that he's embedded in and the role he's taking up in the system. This story is about two systems in interaction. And just like Modell says, the communication is through an affective engagement. But the difference between those two systems is the different missions that each system is involved in. The family's mission is development. Their task is to help every member of the family develop. The treatment system's mission is treatment. And people are guided by that mission and shaped by it in both systems. The interaction is about learning.
I have another question for you. I think it's all embedded together, but I'm interested in what you learned from your group relations work, how that brings this idea forward, the link between small systems and large systems. And I had a little experience of your group relations work because you talked me into going to one of them, and I still remember it vividly and fondly. But do you want to tell us something about what happened there, and maybe particularly how you and Wesley came to become such a writing pair?
Yes. When you and I were working at McLean, I started going to these group relations conferences. I was having trouble at McLean, and both in managing our little program and in figuring out how to manage the program in relation to the rest of the hospital. And to my amazement, I found myself totally out of my awareness, creating a group in this little conference, just like the one I was trying to run at McLean, except with all of the problems, except that here in this weird system, I could see that I couldn't blame it on anybody, that I was doing it. I could see the ways in which my character, my personality, shaped the way my little organization in this conference functioned. And it blew my mind. And I could bring that kind of learning and responsibility back to the program that you and I worked in. It was amazing. It was so amazing that I kept going back to these conferences and started running them. And in one of them, I met Wesley Carr, who was then a young English cleric, subsequently became the Dean of Westminster. And we found an accommodation between our views of the world. He was in a large institution that was engaged in the larger society. I was studying individuals in psychoanalysis and family systems. And the ideas interdigitated, and we developed a friendship and wrote this book called Lost in Familiar Places. Lost in Familiar Places is a wonderful title to talk about what's going on in our current society. There's a little story that I actually like to read, which exemplifies one of the kinds of learning that emerges in these conferences. And it has to do with the relationship between organizational role and family role. I disguised this story in the book, but it's actually about my experience at McLean. So let me try to translate it into English. I reported that I was working in a whole series of institutions. I was at McLean, I was doing psychoanalysis, I was running a group at Tufts, I was involved in the A.K. Rice Institute. I had bits and pieces of ideas that were percolating in various other institutions, and I couldn't find a way to bring them all into one place. And it was driving me batty. And I presented this problem, and the consultant invited me to present my family history. So I presented my family history. My childhood home had to do with my parents living in my grandparents' home because they didn't have enough money. And they were saving money for their new home. We had very little space in my grandfather's home, And my grandfather, who was from Russia, brought in refugees from Russia to live in the basement. Some of them were really quite weird. My two brothers were much older, and I was very young, and the home was filled with bits of relatives and friends and strangers and tensions about who was in charge of what and questions about where my home boundaries were, and everybody was fighting with everybody about anything, and I couldn't understand it. I was very cute as a small child, so I was invited to entertain, but at the same time I was experienced as a bit of a nuisance, and none of what was going on made any sense. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. Why didn't we have a home of our own? And who are all these damn people? As I began to talk about this in the group, bits of my life actually began to make sense. In college, I had studied anthropology and Russian language, and in medical school, I worked in migrant labor camps. I went to the Caribbean and studied a witch doctor. I spent months in Israel studying suicide in Arab villages, and I was running around to all these bits and pieces trying to understand strange customs. Even at McLean, where I was running this little program, surrounded by all these other programs, these older siblings, my world could not be held responsible for creating such a similar role in my work life to that in my family life. I had to take some responsibility for it. So, let me read this bit. The recognition of these parallels resulted in a significant lessening of the struggle I'd been facing. No longer did I find I was in a work trap from which I couldn't emerge. Rather, I began to see the ways in which I was using my family experience to understand something about the world. It was a perspective I had, a lens that was uniquely mine and enabled a way of connecting. I was trying to resolve a family dilemma, and I was using my workplace to address it. Here's the translation. For all of the members of this group, members were all occupying a highly charged space in their organizations and work lives that closely paralleled key family roles of their organizations. They had repeated those roles in the organization. I'll stop there. I carry on a bit in the book, but it's a dazzling discovery. It was for me. How could that possibly happen? You have to think about it in a different way to begin to unpack that kind of discovery. It's those kinds of discoveries that stimulated me to go in this direction.
I was there at McLean, and I did the same thing with my own family dynamics. The next phase of your life that this book tells us about and that you learned from after McLean, after all the group relations conferences, after rising in that organization, you decided to take on an organization yourself. And you became the medical director and CEO of Austin Riggs at a time when psychiatric hospitals that were interested in talking to patients, like Austin Riggs, were threatened by all the factors of managed care and the development of psychiatry as a medical specialty. You managed to take Austin Riggs from near death, I think, and bring it back in a tremendous way. And at the same time, I think you learned a lot. So tell us what's in the book, or what the learning was that helped you when you were helping Austin Riggs.
Yeah. That too was an amazing opportunity. I didn't think so at the time. Because when I got there, things were tough. What I brought to this job were these lenses that I had been developing over the course of my career. One of the things I learned was that the mission of the institution mattered. And the mission of Riggs was when I came, was like the mission of most institutions. It was 3 pages long. and didn't differentiate Riggs in many ways from other similar institutions. And I asked the patients at Riggs while I was living in Boston to articulate in a paragraph the mission that they saw. And I asked the medical staff in their group to articulate a mission that they saw. And I asked the Board of Trustees to do the same. And then I asked them to authorize representatives of each of those three groups to negotiate the difference. And then I asked them to negotiate it with me. And by the time we had done that, we had a shared view of what the mission of the institution was. So we had a way of thinking about us as uniquely Riggs, and of thinking at what we were doing in this institution on behalf of society. And we were able to reduce it to a sentence that we all knew and felt and that mattered to us, and that a set of values and beliefs that we had were engaged. And that was to help people who were called treatment resistant, which were the patients who were being sent to Riggs because they didn't respond to other kinds of treatment, to help so-called treatment resistant patients become people taking charge of their lives. That, in systems thinking, had an input, people who were called treatment resistant, a functioning system, which was intensive psychotherapy, and a therapeutic community, and a massive amount of freedom for the patients. The medical director gave them a budget, they managed their own activities, and an output, people taking charge of their lives. That allowed us to function as a whole. We still had to deal with managed care. When we thought about it, what we recognized was that what managed care was saying that was accurate was that the world had limited resources. And so when we listened to how they were right, which is actually the first chapter of my book, we began to question why being angry at limited resources and learning how to deal with that anger and recognize the reality is an aspect of mental health. So we developed a committee that consisted of business people and clinicians, and they consulted with patients and families who were coming in. The business people figured out what the actual resources were, and the clinicians helped the families deal with the feelings they had about using those resources, whether they were retirement funds or limited insurance, and for many of these families, this happened all the time, a confusion between limited financial resources and limited emotional resources. And once we had brought the outside world back and inside, the treatment improved.
I think we've got some idea of the point of this book, but maybe you could tell us the story of the man on the bus?
The story is, I was at a conference and somebody from the audience presented this story. So this is this guy named Tom, a social worker of West Indian descent and a member of an Anglican church, told the following story. There was a firemen's strike in London. It didn't last very long, maybe a couple of weeks, but there was chaos. People were terrified that buildings would burn down. There was racial tensions on the streets. There were riots. People were under stress. There were fires that were set. Sirens were running through the street, but the firemen were on strike. So this guy from Londoner, from West Indian descent, black guy, is sitting on the bus. There's a white bus driver. There are a bunch of white passengers, and there are a group of black adolescents who begin to hassle the white bus driver, and it's chaos in the outside society. He presents the story, and he says that his thought to himself was, why do I have to do this? He's looking around. Why do I have to do this? This question got into me, and I spent a year thinking about it. He said, I don't like the role I'm in, but he decided, he got up, and he told the kids to cut it out. And which I understood as an act of citizenship. In this event, Tom initially found himself alone. Then he felt himself almost against his will in a role. He felt pulled in ways he couldn't fully articulate or discern into a risky engagement with others. A risky engagement. and with a task that transcended his personal needs. That's why he said, why do I have to do this? That question, why do I have to do this, can be translated, and I translate it, as what groups and what roles do I represent? The answers: black man, father, social worker, church member, British citizen. And from that range of identities, what do I feel moved to do in this particular group, and why? His second comment is similarly puzzling. He says, I don't like the role I'm in. What's the nature of this role? And does he mean that this role doesn't feel like a part of him? How can such a thing happen? The more we become aware that our experience of ourselves is affected by others, not just in our families, but in the larger contexts in which we live, the less sure we seem to be about where our individual experience begins and ends. Each individual can choose a role, making it feel like a part of the self, but alternatively, he can find himself in a role as a consequence of factors beyond his grasp. Unconscious family dynamics, as in the kid story, nonverbal interpersonal pressures, hidden ethnic or social identifications, making it feel somewhat alien. Tom's story begins to raise the central question of this book. What are the steps toward taking up the role of active citizen? He was faced with a crisis. Danger was happening, and he knew something about it. He had to decide who he was in order to locate himself. He recognized his internalized groups and tried to integrate them without diminishing any. Erik Erikson suggests that integrity is our commitment to the most advanced idea that we can get to, despite what it costs. So, Tom's question, why do I have to do this? This, I argue, is a question every citizen has to face. Take up a citizen role requires work, and social engagement includes risk. Why me signals a recognition that I am at stake here, and it's a protest against the risk. What forces would make any individual risk himself on behalf of others? What allows any individual to identify with the whole group so that he knows if they are at risk, he is as well? I think that's what's behind people from many races being on the streets. They have identified with a transcended connection. And this is the argument that I'm trying to make. Tom makes the transition from a member of a subgroup to a citizen. To grasp this transition requires us to review his roles and the social task, the mission that each entails. The first is his role as a black adult male. He can feel the anger of the black kids without being too afraid of it. He's one of them, and he sees how their anger is right. He could convey this to the young people without endorsing their current behavior. George Floyd's family had this capacity, the same kind of capacity. He can convey this to the young people without endorsing their current behavior. Second, through his role as a church member, he's identified with the transcendent interdependency that belief in God entails. I learned this from Wesley Carr. Feeling part of a social whole, Tom can experience the vulnerability of the larger society. Finally, in his role as a father, Tom can respond to the adolescent's developmental need for a limiting context, a paternal presence, at the moment of their rebellion against authority. Tom also said, I don't like this role. His unhappiness points to his role conflict. Identified as a black man, he would inevitably be mad at the kids' disturbance, which cast an unfavorable image of black males. Nonetheless, understanding their anger, he might also unconsciously be tempted to side with them. But though he brought some of his resentment into his decision to act, thinking, why do I, a black man, have to take up a leadership role in a society that treats black people badly, he ultimately overcame the temptation to devalue the rest of his roles. If he had the space to reflect on this process, as I did on his behalf, he might have recognized that in his role conflict, he was containing and potentially unconsciously solving a significant social tension between his ethnic identity and his larger sense of British citizenship. This kind of resolution, if we unpacked it, might inform us about the components of social impasse and some of the linking ideas that allow for joining the larger society. Tom's resolution to ask the kids to be respectful represented both this internal solution and his good enough integration of these multiple roles. This can account for the quality of his insight to the kids, offering the strike of the firefighters as a shared context in which aggression had to be contained. In light of this, Tom's question, why me? Why do I have to do this? Is a question about his integrity. To be all of himself requires him to face his connection to others and the values embedded in these membership. His question can be translated as, what groups am I in now and in what roles? And how do I bridge them and join this society as a citizen? These are questions for all of us. When engaged in tension-filled dialogue, the temptation is to treat others disrespectfully by assigning them to a devalued role and dismissing them. Considering people as others has always been an easy solution to social conflict. We do this by unconsciously choosing an exclusive subgroup to which to belong. This allows us to deny the ways in which, by disconnecting the others, we are also alienating part of ourselves that we cannot stand. This is about the interconnection of humankind. If Tom said back off to the kids at some personal risk. He set a limit to their aggression. Containment as a precondition for exploration and discovery. Anyway, the underlying notions behind the story, joining, membership, mission, containment, and roles, are the steps any individual takes toward a social interpretation from within the self. Integration of these roles into coherent identity allows identification with the larger social context and beginnings of membership, and citizenship, which has to be negotiated with others, if you can listen to how they write. As I said, a difficult task.
Yeah. You know, I have lots of ideas stirred up by this. I think identifications with good parts of people are very important as we try to take up these roles. Ed, I want to thank you for being so generous with your book and for thinking through these complex ideas to get to something that is so very important. And we've only scratched the surface in this discussion. So I'm going to suggest to anybody who's watching this discussion that it makes sense to get the book and spend some time with it and listen to Ed's ideas in full.
Thank you very much, John. I can't imagine a better conversation with somebody that I love. Appreciate it.